On a rocky cliff over the churning seas of the English Channel, a 42-year-old artist with a bushy beard and a beret set up his easel. He loved to paint the sea. He loved the shifting colors and shapes of the waves in the sky above them. He loved the way the gray-white mist hovered and floated, concealing this, revealing that. He watched the sunlight reflect off the water, then disappear in the mist, then emerge again to add sparkle to the sea foam. He put his brush to the canvas, dotting blue here, splashing yellow there, in broad strokes that could capture the mood of the moment. He worked rapidly and with complete concentration. So much concentration that he didn't notice the waves sweeping closer and closer as the tide moved in. Claude Monet always worked outdoors. For years he had propped his easel up beside rivers and canals, in parks, gardens and fields, and in the middle of train stations and city streets. It seemed natural to him to do his work right there where he could see his subject. It seemed sensible that he, who had worshipped nature from childhood, would make nature his studio. But what seemed natural and sensible to Monet was to the world revolutionary. Before Claude Monet, no one had painted landscapes outdoors. Instead, artists made their sketches and drawings outdoors, then carted them back to their studios for the actual painting or for the final touches. Not Monet. He started outdoors, and he finished outdoors. He wanted to paint what he saw at the moment he saw it. He wanted to capture the changing moments of nature as they occurred. In this innocent, spontaneous approach to his work, Monet became the originator and founder of a new style of art that rocked Paris and later the world. The waves were still pounding closer on the French coastline as Monet focused instead on the light as it filtered through the mist. Light was his muse. While others looked at shapes and angles, at perspectives and dimensions, he looked at the light and how it played off ripply water, half-open flowers, waving grass, and cloudy skies. Now, as he studied like a scientist the effect of the afternoon sun on the grainy sand, he was suddenly taken by a wave. In one surge, it knocked both him and the easel to the ground, then claimed the easel and swept it into the sea. Monet half rose and struggled to hold on to the rocky embankment before him, but a second wave hit. His hands lost their grip, and he too was dragged into the sea, sputtering and flailing his arms. The tide held him under until, no breath left, he felt his senses begin to dim. But he continued to reach and kick, and somehow, whether through his own effort or that of the sea, he was deposited on land again. He scurried to high ground and collapsed, panting. The easel and its canvas did not return. Monet looked over the ocean and saw the light had changed again. The school of painting founded in Paris started in the 1870s and continued right up to the turn of the century. If there is one exact moment when it began, it is a moment in 1874 at the studio of a well-known Parisian photographer named Paul Nader. Nader had offered his studio to a small group of artist friends who wanted to exhibit their paintings. They'd already tried to submit them to the official salons in Paris, but the stuffy salons had sent them packing. The work was too unconventional. It was too personal. It wasn't art. The artists, all of whom were rather bold and defiant types, decided they didn't need the salons. They'd organize their own exhibit. Nader's studio was a popular hangout for bohemians and social rebels, so it seemed just the right place. In they marched that spring day in 1874, canvases and easels piled in their arms. 8 struggling stones named Paul Cézanne, Edgar Degas, Camille Pissarro, Alfred Sisley, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Berthe Morisot, Armand Guillaumin, and Claude Monet. They called themselves the Société Anonyme, the Anonymous Society. The public and the critics marched in too, and most of them marched right out. Claude Monet has declared war on beauty, proclaimed one critic, and another critic, known for his satirical style and tough-to-please attitude, gave the artists a nickname that would go down in history. He got the name from looking at one of the paintings in the show called Impressionism, Sunrise. Later, he mockingly labeled all the artists in the exhibit these Impressionists. The painting that had inspired such disdain, Impression Sunrise, was the work of Claude Monet. Today, he is one of the most admired artists in the world, and Impressionism, the movement he started, is one of the most popular styles of art with both critics and the public alike. There are entire museums that devote themselves to the Impressionist period alone, one of the most famous being the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. To the art connoisseur, Impressionism is known for its spontaneity, for its ability to capture the effect of changing light and atmosphere on the subject. To the average person, Impressionism means all those blurry, fuzzy pictures that make it seem like you're looking at life through somebody else's glasses. A lot of people know Impressionist paintings from their popularity on postcards, posters, and greeting cards. Impressionist art tends to be colorful, pretty, and soothing. Since Impressionism is so generally pleasing to the eye, what did all those 19th century critics have to complain about? They complained chiefly because it was new, it broke the rules, and they didn't understand it, the same reason critics have always complained throughout the centuries. At the time Claude Monet and his anonymous friends hit the scene, art was traditional and predictable. It belonged to one of two schools, the neoclassic or the romantic. Neoclassic art had been around since the French Revolution and marked a return to older styles and subjects, which included a lot of portraits of members of the nobility. It was a flashback to ancient Greek and Roman art. The Romantic school, which competed with the Neoclassic school, produced paintings that were emotional, exotic, and somewhat excessive. It included a lot of battle scenes, hunt scenes, death scenes, and high drama. One might call it artistic sensationalism. What Monet and the other Impressionists had to offer was very different. To begin with, their settings were entirely new. These settings made it seem as if they were on one perpetual holiday. They painted beaches, picnics in the park, boating on the river, gondolas in Venice, luncheons in the garden, regattas, ballerinas, and card players. More important was how they looked at these scenes. They weren't interested in precise details or clear lines. They were interested in the effects of nature, which they studied closely, and they were interested in visual phenomena. That is, how sunlight played on air and water, how shadows from trees dappled the lawn, or how the colors in a pool of water changed as the sun set. They filled their paintings with color and light, abandoning shades of gray and brown, and even painting their shadows in pastels. The overall effect the Impressionists were striving for required new techniques. The anonymous eight, Monet at the lead, discovered these techniques one after the other. They discovered that if they put strokes of pure color side by side, they could achieve a certain radiance in their work. They discovered if they used little dots of color repeated through a painting, their work would sparkle. This technique is called divisionism. It's called that because the colors aren't mixed together on a palette to get the desired hue, as was traditional, but are left separate and divided and placed side by side for an equal or stronger effect. They also discovered that if they left their brushstrokes bold and forceful and didn't smooth them over, they achieved a sort of vitality in their paintings. And they decided that instead of working from models and sketches, they would take their canvases right out into the open where the color and light was real. In art, this is called plein air painting, after the French term for open air. The open air had always been where Claude Monet wanted to be. As a child, he was raised in Le Havre, a busy French seaport up north on the English Channel. There, he spent his free time scrambling up the cliffs, running on the beaches, and watching the boats sailing in the harbor. Monet had not been born in Le Havre. He was born in Paris on November 14, 1840, the same year his future friend and colleague Renoir was born. It was also the year Napoleon's ashes were brought back from exile and placed at the Invalides in Paris. It was the ending of an era in France and the beginning of a new one. France was about to enter its industrial revolution when the focus of life would shift from the country to the cities. The cities offered people work, and it offered artists and intellectuals a sense of community and support. In the cities of France, as in the cities of America and England, a new class was on the rise, the middle class. The middle class worked hard and used its extra time and dollars for entertainment. In Paris, that meant trips to the racetrack, to the park, to the opera and music halls, and weekend excursions by train to the seashore or the countryside. All this hustle and bustle of the new age would center itself in Paris, where suddenly everything seemed new. The clothes, the mannerisms, the language, the lifestyle, and the art were all about to change. Monet's parents moved from Paris to Le Havre when he was 5 years old, in hopes of setting up a wholesale grocery business. Claude didn't mind the move. The seashore and its cliffs had too much to offer a lively boy with a passion for nature. What he did mind was school. In both grammar school and high school, he spent his time drawing cartoons of the teachers, exaggerated caricatures that delighted his friends but caused trouble with the principal. At 15, he started selling his caricatures to other students for 20 francs apiece. Monet had an aunt, Aunt Sophie, who was an amateur artist and had converted her attic into a studio. When he wasn't out watching the boats go by, he was in Aunt Sophie's studio making drawings of them. Some of those drawings were exhibited in a local art supply shop next to the paintings of artist Eugène Boudin. Boudin, a specialist in seascapes, offered to take Monet on as a student. Monet eagerly agreed, and from that moment on, he would evolve into the great landscape painter we know today. Boudin made an extraordinary suggestion to his new student. Why not paint outdoors? It would give the paintings a power, a vividness one doesn't find in a studio. So off they went to the seashore with their paints and brushes and their observant, appreciative eyes. When Monet was 17, his mother died and he moved in with Aunt Sophie. He stayed there 2 years until he could no longer resist the pull that every young artist in France felt, the pull of Paris. He arrived at the age of 19, full of confidence and energy, hoping to win an art fellowship that would pay his way. When that fellowship fell through, his confidence wavered for only a moment. He refused his father's demand that he return home and take up the grocery business, and instead rented a small room in the city, hoping he could make his living by selling caricatures to the newspapers. After all, it had worked back home. But Paris was a tougher place than Le Havre, and Monet's hope failed. He sold only one drawing. Now began the years of struggle. Although his family pressured Monet to study with conventional painters in Paris, he opted instead for the more liberal Académie Suisse, which was free and didn't have formal classes. There he met the first of his future comrades in the coming art revolution, Camille Pissarro. In his free time, Monet did what all young artists in Paris did. He hung out in the cafes with other artists, drawing sketches and exchanging ideas about styles and techniques. It was an exciting time, and except for his empty pockets, it was a happy time. But that was all soon to change. Monet was about to be drafted. By now it was 1860, and Monet was 20 years old. By law, he was required to register for military service and take his chances in a lottery. He did, and he lost. He joined a regiment serving in Algeria in the north of Africa. The army doesn't seem the most appropriate place for a creative young artist like Claude Monet, but he made the best of it. He focused on what he focused on everywhere, the light. Monet found the bright sunlight and the desert landscape of Africa beautiful. Every moment he could, he sketched it. But within only a year, he contracted typhoid fever and was sent home to Aunt Sophie on sick leave. There he resumed his painting lessons, while Aunt Sophie plotted a way to free him from his remaining 5 years of service. Finally, she paid another man to take his place. As soon as he recovered, Monet darted back to Paris and took up art lessons again, this time with the Swiss painter Charles Gleyre. He didn't stay long. Gleyre used models in his classes and showed no interest in landscapes. Two practices that would never work for Claude Monet. He made friends in this time with 3 other young painters, Renoir, Alfred Sisley, and Jean-Frédéric Bazille, and together they made side trips to the coast and the countryside where they experimented together, painting outdoors directly from nature. That fall, Monet sold one of his first paintings. It was a still life bought by a ship owner from his hometown of Le Havre. Meanwhile, Monet's family was raising a fuss about his avant-garde lifestyle, and more to the point, his penniless lifestyle. His father cut off his allowance, and Monet moved into an apartment with his new friend Bazille. He sold 2 more landscapes in 1865 when he was 25 years old, and then he began work on a large canvas named Picnic, inspired by a Manet painting of the same name. It's no wonder people sometimes confuse the 2 artists. Their names are almost identical. They lived and worked in the same place at the same time, and they made paintings with the same titles. But the O in Monet's name is always the clue that he was the originator of Impressionism. Luncheon on the Grass was a memorable painting, not just for its broad, flat brushstrokes and its background of dots and patches of color, but because of the woman who modeled for it. Her name was Camille Dancieux, and she was to become Monet's lover and eventually his first wife. Monet continued to paint, using Camille as his model for many of his pictures, including Women in the Garden, for which she posed for all 4 of the women in the scene. In spite of his newfound love, these were hard years for Monet. His family disapproved of him living with Camille and cut him off completely. He moved with Camille to a house in Sèvres, a suburb of Paris, but was evicted when he couldn't pay his rent. And finally, he had to leave Sèvres altogether because of bad debts. He returned to Paris alone and was rescued by his friend Basile, who bought Women in the Garden and offered him his apartment, along with the also down-on-his-luck Renoir. Basile was just the kind of friend every struggling young artist should have. He had a wealthy family and generously shared his money with his friends who didn't. He, too, was an aspiring artist, but he was killed only a few years later in the Franco-Prussian War at the age of 29. In 1867, Camille joined Monet in Paris, where she gave birth to their son they named Jean. The following spring, Monet won a silver medal for his paintings, but unfortunately the medal couldn't pay the bills. The young father was so deeply in debt now that creditors confiscated his paintings, and he didn't even have enough money to buy brushes and paint. Again, he was rescued, this time by the wealthy ship owner who'd bought his landscape painting a few years earlier. The gentleman bought all of Monet's paintings back from the creditors and hired Monet to come to his house in Étretat near Le Havre to paint his wife's portrait. Monet took Camille and Jean with him and rented them a cottage. He took a liking to Étretat and would return there often over the years. It was there, when he was 45 years old, that he was almost drowned while painting the sea. When he finished his work on the portrait, Monet returned to Paris penniless again and settled into an apartment near Renoir. Renoir would sneak bread from his mother's house so that Monet would have something to eat. The 2 artists would walk down to the Seine, set up their easels, and work side by side as they painted the water, the boats, and the bathers. Monet would munch on his slab of bread while he studied the light and the colors. Then he would get to work, painting with rapid brushstrokes, dabbing spots and dots, trying to capture the atmosphere. He would throw violent tantrums if the weather changed, altering the light for his painting. He would also take home and burn anything he wasn't happy with. During this time, Monet came up against a technical challenge. He was beginning to work on larger and larger canvases too big to set up an easel outside. But he was determined. Nothing must separate him from nature and the vision it had to offer. So he dug a trench and constructed his own device for lowering an 8-foot canvas into it and went on, as usual, out into the open. 1870, when he turned 30, was an eventful but stressful year for Monet. His works were refused at the Paris Salon for exhibit. He married Camille, and France declared war on Germany, forcing him to flee to London for fear he'd be drafted again. Monet loved London. Among other things, he loved the fog. He liked anything that changed light and atmosphere: fog, mist, sunrise and sunset, the steam of railroad engines. While in London, he found the Thames River made a good substitute for the Seine, and so he spent his time on the riverbanks painting the boats. He arranged an exhibit of his work in London, where the salons seemed less snobby than those in Paris, but he was unable to sell a single picture. After London, Monet and Camille traveled to Holland, where he could paint the canals. More water, more boats, and new and different light. He became inspired by some Japanese prints that a clerk had wrapped his groceries in, and began to work the bright colors and unusual arrangements into his own work. By 1871, the war was over, and Monet and Camille returned to France, settling in a little suburb called Argenteuil, where he could be closer to nature. By now, his style was well developed. He worked with thick, bright, short brushstrokes and tried to capture the form of objects and the changing atmosphere around them. A French art dealer named Paul Cézanne started to buy his pictures, and life began to look up again. Now, a new Claude Monet began to emerge, a Monet who was a likely extension of Monet the painter, Monet the nature lover. In Argenteuil, he also became Monet the gardener. In time, his elaborate gardens would become almost as famous as his paintings, but for now, he contented himself with a simple plot of roses and dahlias. The money was coming in, but for some reason it was going out even faster. Monet was always late with his rent and tried to borrow money from almost everyone he knew. He'd write to his friends over and over, pleading for help, telling them he'd be thrown in jail by his creditors. It seemed no matter how much he made, no matter how much he was given, he always needed more. Some of that money went for a barge. In his quest to get closer and closer still to nature, he had a boat built with a cabin on top he could use as a studio. Now he could paint right on the water, watching close up the play of light and the reflections of clouds floating overhead. He worked from sun up until sundown, no matter what the weather. It was this year, when he was 33, that Monet and his friends finally decided to beat the system and organized their own exhibit in Paris at their friend Nader's studio. Few came, and all who did laughed. No one even suspected the profound influence these Impressionists would soon have on the history of art and the painters who would follow them. Monet was not the least bit discouraged by the poor showing in Paris. He was confident, and he was persistent. He believed in his own work and cared little what other people thought. The work went on. Monet was poor again, out of brushes and paint again, and as always, he was rescued again. This time it was the owner of a Paris department store who asked Monet to paint 4 large panels in his dining room. The same year, Monet helped organize a second exhibit of Impressionism, but it was no more popular than the first. No matter. He rented a small studio in Paris near the Saint-Lazare railway station and switched his attention from rivers and sunlight to engines and steam. He painted hazy visions of passengers hustling to the trains, a lasting tribute to the dawn of the industrial age. Several of his Saint-Lazare paintings were included in yet another Impressionism exhibit in 1877, when he was 37 years old. The public still couldn't understand the dots and splashes and rough brushstrokes, and Monet was as poor and unrecognized as before. The next year, Camille gave birth to their second child, another son named Michael. To cut expenses, they moved into a house with Alice Ochaudet, the wife of the department store owner who'd hired Monet to paint his dining room. Since that day, Ochaudet had gone bankrupt, so Alice and her 6 children moved in with Camille and Claude and Jean and Michael, in a house with no heating, no food, and 11 people, none of whom could make a living. At this moment, when it seemed life couldn't get any darker, it did just that. Camille developed cancer. She was nursed by Alice, but died within a year, leaving Monet in a state of shock, not over his loss, but over his own inability to feel grief. When she was dead, he took out his brushes and painted her portrait in an attempt to capture that ever-elusive light, this time as it played on her still silent face. Stunned by his own reaction, he said later, "Finding myself at the deathbed of a woman who had been and still was very dear to me, I caught myself with my eyes focused on her tragic temples in the act of automatically searching for the succession, the arrangement of color gradations that death was imposing on her motionless features." The following year, the Impressionists organized yet another exhibit, but this time they quarreled among themselves and ended up going their separate ways. Monet moved to Poissy, a town near Paris, and finally, as he entered his 40s, his work began to get some attention. At a 7th Impressionist exhibit, he showed 35 paintings, and he began to make a decent living. He took Alice Ochaudet and her 6 children and moved to a village in the Seine Valley that would forever after be connected with the name Monet. The village was called Giverny, and it is here that Monet would plant his fabulous gardens and paint some of his most famous works, including his series of water-lilies. Over the next years, Monet had many more exhibits, and by the late 1880s, he was getting high prices for his paintings and making a good living. Still, he continued to ask for money from his friends, probably to help finance his farmhouse, his vast lands with flower beds, his greenhouse, and his barn that he transformed into a studio. What Monet had painted for over 30 years, he now began to create. He constructed a man-made pond on his property, and he built Japanese bridges over it. He planted hundreds of rows and plots of flowers, carefully positioning them on the basis of color and fragrance. He constructed stone walls around his garden, and as he grew older, he stayed behind the walls, seldom allowing visitors, who came in droves as his fame increased. He shuffled around in his wooden shoes, a beret or floppy hat on his head, caring for his flowers and dabbing at his easel. When he was 51, Monet finally married Alice, whose husband had died shortly before. In winters, they would go to the seashore, but they also took trips to the Riviera, to Madrid, to Venice, and of course to London, where Monet could check on his beloved fog. By the time he was in his 60s, Monet's eyesight began to fail him. He continued to work on both his gardens and his painting, but gradually it became more and more difficult. When he was 70, Alice died, but his reaction this time as an old man was far different from his reaction to the death of his first wife, Camille. He plunged into grief, barely ever leaving his house and garden. Soon he developed cataracts and had to wear thick glasses, but he kept working, creating paintings of such enormous size that he had to build a special studio just to hold them. Then, the biggest change of all occurred. Claude Monet began to paint his landscapes and his cherished flowers while working indoors. He sketched them outside, then took the sketches to his studio and completed them there. World War I came and went, and Monet barely left his garden. He wandered around the weeping willows, the bamboo, and the irises, his vision becoming dimmer and dimmer, until nature must have looked to him just as his paintings look to us. His thick, long beard had now grown white, and he dressed in loose country jackets, always with a hat upon his head. In 1923, Monet had cataract surgery, and shortly after he developed lung cancer. He was now almost completely blind. The light disappeared, the shadows only remained, and Claude Monet ceased to paint. In the last days of his life, he spent his time wandering through his garden, taking in the exquisite fragrance of his flowers. He died on December 5, 1926, at the age of 86, and, as requested, was buried without ceremony. Today, the main street in Giverny is called Rue Claude Monet. His home is a national landmark, and thousands of people from all over the world come to wander his gardens and watch the floating water lilies that he made immortal. It is said that the light that filters through his garden is unlike any other place on earth. As an artist, Claude Monet never had an interest in copying nature. He sought instead to see nature. His delight in colors, shapes, and light is apparent in every painting he ever made. His commitment to the truth of nature shines through in every river, every sky, every flower. A beautiful painting he made of Camille in 1870 at the beach in Trouville now hangs in the Tate Museum in London. If one looks closely, one can see grains of sand still embedded in the paint. Monet's most popular work dates from about the 1870s on. The first of these are his paintings of the Saint-Lazare train station in Paris. This was the first time he tried to paint the same object from different viewpoints. He plopped himself down right in the middle of the station for days upon end, oblivious to the noise and the distraction, enthralled by the puffs of steam and smoke, and how they altered the light, the colors, the atmosphere. In the early 1890s, when he was in his 50s, Monet began the unique practice of painting several pictures of the same identical scene. Each showed the scene at a different time of day, or a different season, or a different year altogether. There was a famous series of haystacks, of the Rouen Cathedral as it changed from dawn to dusk, of the Seine at his home in Giverny, of the canals and palaces of Venice, and of the Thames River in London. He once bought an entire row of poplar trees so he could paint a series of them before anyone chopped them down. But the most famous series, and the most beautiful, are his paintings of the water lilies that graced his homemade pond in Giverny. There are several groups of the water lily series, many of them painted on huge canvases, entitled Nymphéas. The vibrant, swirling colors of these paintings would later influence many other artists, including the abstract painters. Monet's murals of his water lilies became larger and larger, and after his death, several of them were installed in Paris in two 80-foot oval rooms at the Orangerie of the Tuileries. The sensational effect led the painter André Vasson to label them the Sistine Chapel of Impressionism. It was a fitting tribute, for like Michelangelo, Claude Monet was an artist who never faltered in his faith. When his family tried to steer him towards a more conventional lifestyle, he stood firm, even though it meant he would lose their financial support. When the critics and the public laughed at him, not once, but over and over, he only became more committed. When poverty and humiliation would have deterred many others, he simply ignored it and proceeded. When the size of his paintings threatened his ability to work outside in nature, he invented his own device for transporting and stabilizing his canvas. When no garden and no location offered him the color and light he so desperately sought, he built his own. When other Impressionists abandoned the art form, he alone remained true to it until the very end. And when his eyes, the very instruments of his profession, began to fail, he worked on, using whatever light was left to him. Like the day on the Atlantic sea coast when he was nearly swallowed by the sea, Claude Monet never once took his mind, his heart, or his eyes off his vision of beauty.